Structured event logging is so much more than just writing a message to a file. Since .NET Core natively supports structured event logging, I wanted to introduce a logger that takes advantage of these additional features. Serilog is an easy to configure and easy to use logging system that you can plug into a .NET Core project within minutes. Today, we're going to configure Serilog, see how to use it in a basic logging scenario, then take advantage of the structured logging by hooking up a visual event sync called Seq or SEQ. The source code for today's video is available to download using the link below in the description. You will also find links there to sign up for my mailing list and for my Patreon. Just last week, mailing list members and Patreon members received special discounts on my courses that were not offered anywhere else. Now, if you haven't come across me before, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. One of the ways I do that is by teaching context. There are a lot of tutorials out there that teach you what to do. I go a few steps beyond that to show you when to do it, why you should or should not do it, what pitfalls to avoid, and what the best practices are. Basically, I get you ready for the real world. If that's the type of training you're interested in, subscribe to my channel and hit the little bell icon to be notified when I release new videos. Okay, let's go over to Visual Studio. And what we're going to do today is we're going to create a new project that is a ASP.NET Core web application. This is the easiest way of getting started. We can also do a worker service because that also has the built-in logging. It'd be a little bit harder, but we could do it with a console app or even a desktop app. Those just don't, by default, start up the logger in the same way. And so you have to do a little bit more tweaking. I just want to get right to logging, so we're going to do an ASP.NET Core web application. Hit Next. We're going to call this the Serilog Demo and the Serilog Demo app. You click Create. And the purpose here is, of course, not to create a really full-featured web application. It's more just to create an application that allows us to do some logging. Now I'm going to choose a web application that is configured for HTTPS, but no Docker and no authentication. Now right now it's .NET Core 3.1. That's because I've got a preview version of Visual Studio, and it won't let me choose .NET Core 3.0 in this dropdown anymore, which is a little frustrating. But it's okay, because 3.0 will work just the same as this 3.1 does. In fact, I can even roll back to 3.0 in my project, and I probably will, just so you can see it and work with it in the production version, not the pre-production version. So we'll hit Create, and once that gets created, notice it's downloading the project information, or it will be. Let's go over to our Manage. Here we'll edit our project and change this to 3.0, and then do a rebuild to make sure that will build. We have a failure. All right, and it says that the OBJ folder, there's a project.assets.json that doesn't have the right version. No problem. We're going to open folder in File Explorer. Oh, there it is. Open another part of the screen. We're going to delete the bin and OBJ folders. Those are folders you do not need. They get recreated for you when you rebuild. Now when I do a rebuild, it should be that restores the correct versions and it builds succeed, which it does. So we're all set. Now we have a 3.0 project. So even if you did have 3.1, that would work, but you could also run it on a production machine that has 3.0. So no worries there if you don't have the preview version like I do. So this is a basic ASP.NET Razor Pages web application. And in it, we have our index.cshtml.cs project, which is pulling out a logger, and we can do some quick logging on this. So we could say logger.log information and say you requested the index page. Okay, real quick, it's already baked in using the iLogger inside of ASP.NET Core. Now, iLogger is an interface. which means we can plug any type of concrete value against that as long as it implements the iLogger interface. So right now it's using the built-in logger, but we can change that to use Serilog in just a minute. But first, let's change this to say Serilog demo, which what this does is it starts what's called Kestrel. And Kestrel is a web server that allows us to see the command line of what's actually going on with our web application. So I'm going to start that. I'm going to pull it over here. This is our Kestrel. And if we scroll up here, it's going to be kind of hidden because it's still an info event. But in here should be our request where it says, hey, you requested the index page. And it's in here. Let me see if I can find it. Right there. So info, and it says you requested the index page. There's our logging event. Now there's all these other log events that are happening as well. Well, these events are ones that Microsoft has put logging in their stuff so you can see what's happening around your application. So for example, the page action invoker with the value of 4 inside, I'm not sure what 4 stands for, execute the page index in 101.2404 milliseconds. So a tenth of a second, it loaded the index page. All right, and there's a whole bunch more information here as far as getting information for JavaScript and a bunch more. So this is all the stuff that's going on. This is a very, very helpful window to be viewing. Instead of the IIS, this Kestrel window allows you to see what's happening with your web server. So for example, I'm going to click Office. Actually, I'll bring it on the screen. But watch this window. When I bring this window over here and I click on Privacy. Okay, hey, nothing's happened. Awesome. I think the reason why is if I have, there we go, I had to hit enter. So I had paused the screen because I had been clicking on it. But now if we go back to privacy again, notice it now goes to the privacy page and it shows us more information about how long it took, the return message, which was 200, meaning success, and so on. So you can see every time you get an action, it shows you what values go on behind the scenes. That can be very helpful. That's part of the logging system. Now let's add a little bit more logging, because this is not necessarily a here's what logging is in .NET Core 3. I have a video on that, and I'll link that in the description probably. But this is not a video on just logging. It's about using Serilog with our logging. So let's set up a few things in here just to make a little bit more logging information for us. So I'm going to do a try here. I'm going to catch an exception. And in this catch, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a logger.log error, where you pass in the exception, and then you pass in a message saying, hey, we caught GHT, there we go, caught this exception in the index get call. Okay, and that's just going to catch an exception. But we have to throw an exception first. So let's do this. Let's do let's just do a throw. Throw new exception. This is our demo exception. So you're going to come into the onGet. It's going to log something, and then immediately it's going to do a try catch, and in the try, it's going to throw an exception, which immediately goes to the catch, catches the exception, and then logs that exception. Is this a standard thing to do? Of course not. You don't just throw exceptions just to catch them. But what this will do is it will give us an actual exception to put into our logger. In fact, let's make it a little bit better I'm going to cut this out temporarily. And I'm going to do a for loop where I is less than 100. So start from 0 and loop up. And we're going to say if I equals 56. So 56, when I is 56, then throws exception. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to log. So we're going to say logger.log log info, and we'll say the information is, let's do this. The value of I is, and we're going to put our value here. Okay, like so. In fact, I'm going to call this the I variable. All right. Now, one of the things that I have heard before is, oh, Tim, you made a mistake. You need to put the $sign first. And that's incorrect. You do not put the $sign here. These curly braces are different than string interpolation. Okay? String interpolation, you put the $sign first, and then you put a variable in here. Instead, this looks a little bit more like the string.format, or what you do in a console write line, where you have the curly braces here, and then it refers to a variable after the fact. Okay? This is where we get into structured event logging. So what happens here in a simple logger is it's going to take this value of I and place it into the first variable in line, this variable. Now, I could have called this I, and I initially did, but I call it I variable for a very important reason. I want you to realize that this name does not correspond to this name. It does not matter what these two are named. It's based upon position. And the reason that is valuable is because you can have something called I, but really what this is a loop count value. And you call it loop count value. In this case, I'm going to call it I variable. I could call it loop count variable or value. Okay? And it's still going to work just as fine. All right? But what this does when structured event logging is used is it will save this string, the output of the string, which is going to put 1, 2, 3, 4 in this spot. But it will also save separately this as the variable name and then the value as the actual variable value. And it's going to save that separately. So we can pull it out. We can do searches based upon that. We can do filtering based upon that and all the rest. So very important, these structured event logs. But right now we're not using structured event logs. We're using the basic event logs that come with our application or with inside of ASP NET Core. So let's run this again, and we're going to see what happens in our structured event. Okay, so it just happened. We scroll up. We got our 1 through 55. So the value of I is 53, 54, 55, 56. It throws an exception. We caught this exception in the index call. We got a fail message. Okay. Now we didn't continue on after that because I put the catch outside of the for each. We can change that if you want. I'm not going to. We're going to leave it just like that. So it's going to log 0 through 55, and then it's going to fail on number 56 and catch that exception. Okay? So that's our setup for our applications. All it's going to do. Now let's look at logging. Let's start by going to the program.cs file. In this program.cs file, let's first of all fix this. I like using the block body for this. It does make a formatting mess, but using the block body allows you a little bit nicer and cleaner, I think, but it's up to you if you want that format. Either way, it's just putting the curly braces around, that's all it's doing, versus the arrow function. Okay, so we have this static void main, and this is the entry point for our web application. But what I want to do is add logging right from the start. So I am going to set up Serilog right here. The first thing I'm going to do is I've got to talk to the configuration file, the app.config file, or the appsetings.json file, which right now has some settings for the built-in logger, which I'm going to get rid of in just a minute. But first, I want to pull settings from this for Serilog, because you may have seen Serilog being configured right in code, and that's fine for quick and dirty, get get it working. What you really want to do is you want to configure an appsetings.json, because then you can change it at runtime. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to say var configuration equals new configuration builder, not binder, builder. Then I'm going to say add JSON file, and the JSON file is appsetings.json. And then I'm going to say build. And what this will do is it's going to build a configuration system. So it's iConfiguration root. This is because we don't yet have dependency injection at this point in our application. That comes later. And so we can't just ask for an iConfiguration value. We have to essentially do what the system is doing behind the scenes later. We have to do it now, and that's ask for configuration. Now, I am just asking for appsetings.json. I am not doing key vault. I am not doing environmental variables. I'm not doing the appsetings.development.json file. I'm not doing any of those things, just the one file. And that's okay. And the reason why is because this appsetings.json file is where I will store everything all the time, even for production. Normally you have all those different options because at production or in staging or in your test environment, you're going to want those in different places. So for example, a connection string, you're going to want to have in appsetings.json for local testing, but then for production, you won't want to have it in appsetings.json. You'll probably want it in either the environmental variables in, let's say, Azure, or you'll want it in your Azure Key Vault in order to keep it secure and not accessible. And so you want to override those settings. For logging, we're not going to go that route. We're just going to store everything here. If you wanted to change it at some point later, you could do that, but I think this is plenty for what we need. It's not the same as secured passwords, okay? This is just settings for your logging. So it sets up and says, okay, you can now talk to the configuration builder. That's step one. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to say log dot logger equals new logger configuration. Now, right now it's yelling at me and saying, I don't know where this stuff is. And if we do a drop down here, I'm not even sure the control dot will find anything. Oh, it does. Install package Serilog. Okay, so it can install a package Serilog for us. We're going to do that manually. So let's go to our dependencies, right click and say manage NuGet packages. We're going to go to browse. And we're going to search for Serilog dot ASP NET Core. So this is the Serilog for ASP.NET Core logging. Now, if you were doing a hosted service like a worker service, you might choose the hosted services extension instead. But this will work just fine. You can also just install just Serilog, which is a base, but this has got a few more features for us. And it does have a dependency on Serilog, so it's going to install that anyway. All right, so we'll install that and accept. And now we can come back to our program.cs, and if we do a control dot, it's going to have the add using Serilog at the top. All right, now that we've done that, we can say dot read from, and we need another extension for this. So there is now a way to read from our configuration file until we go back to our dependencies. You might want to keep this open because we're going to go a couple times more. But I did want to show what each part did. All right, so Serilog dot settings dot configuration. So this is going to read from our appsetings.json file. So Serilog.settings.configuration. I'll leave it open. And now we can say read from dot configuration. Oops, you know what? That shouldn't be that should be logger configuration. There we go. Now you have to pass in a configuration here, which I just passed in this variable right here. So dot build. Oops, not dot build, dot create logger. There we go. I was reading the top, this line up here. So you got this logger now set up. So this part needs that Serilog.ASP NET Core. That's what it needs. Then this right here needs the Serilog.settings.configuration package. And then once you do those two things, now we're reading from the configuration file, the appsetings.json, for our Serilog settings. Now, if you see an example online, you may see, instead of this read from, you may see different settings that actually set up the different loggers. So, for example, you might see something like write to dot file, and then it's got some configuration in that file. Okay, that's pretty typical for the examples. However, that's configuring your logger right in code. We're not going to do that today. We're going to configure it all in our appsetings.json. So the only configuration we have for our logger is going to be from the appsetings.json file. That's it. Okay? Now, before we leave this, I do want to wrap this. So I'm actually going to do a Control X here, just easier. You can do surround with. I found that it's just not quite as easy as I want it to be. So we're going to first have a try catch. We're going to have our line pasted back in here. And we'll do a log.information here that says application starting up. That's going to be a log message that says our application is starting up. Pretty obvious. However, I want you to note that since we're in static void main, we have to use the static keyword log, and we call log.information, not log information. So it's a little different because it's not using iLogger right now. It's using the Serilog logger, which when we call for an iLogger later, it will be the Serilog logger, but it will be in that interface, and so we'll use the interface like normal. But before we get to the interface, because remember we don't have dependency injection yet, we can just call log dot, and there's information, error, and all the rest. So we'll start by saying, hey, our application is starting up, and then actually start our application. This catch here is just in case something bad were to happen in our application, we're going to say log dot, and we'll go with full fatal. Fatal normally you reserve for if the application totally bombs, if it's done, if it crashes, unhandled exceptions, those type of things. Well, if you can't even start your application, that's a fatal exception. So pass in our exception and say the application failed to even start, or failed to start correctly. How about that? Okay, so now you have a try catch. The one last thing you want to add here is a finally. Remember, finally will try catch finally, whether we go through the try successfully or not, whether we hit a catch or not, either way, in both of those scenarios, we're going to run the finally code, no matter what. So this is kind of cleanup code, all right? So you want to make sure that you have this finally because we want to have the log.close and flush. And what this does is if you have any log messages that are still pending, they haven't written yet, this will make sure that it pushes those, makes sure they're written, and then closes the log. All right, so it's going to close it correctly. So that's now all in our static void main. If we scroll down a little bit into our create host builder down here, right after create default builder, we want to have one more thing. So dot use Serilog. And what that will do is we'll use Serilog as the logger of choice rather than the built-in .NET Core logging system. Okay, let's go over to our appsetings.json. And in here, I'm going to remove this logging section because this is for Microsoft's logging. But before I do, let's go back 1 second. Notice that the default is information, meaning information logs or entries are higher. So information, warning, error, fatal. There's, I think, a couple more in there. But those and above will get logged. I think it's debug that won't get logged when you have information level, okay? So there's that hierarchy that you can look up, but the hierarchy says, in this case, start the information above, nothing lower than that. But there's exceptions. For Microsoft and for Microsoft.hosting.lifetime, for Microsoft it says warning, and then for Microsoft.hosting.lifetime it says information. What that's doing is saying, the most specific rule wins. So if a namespace where the log message is coming from starts with Microsoft, it has to be a warning level or higher in order to get logged. But there's an exception to that. If the namespace is Microsoft.hosting.lifetime, that'll be information again. Okay? So there's some filtering going on here to say, based upon where it's coming from, what kind of message do we want to log? Everything or some things. Normally you want to log at the warning level or higher. But I just want to kind of point that out before we delete this because we're going to add our own filtering system and it's a little bit different. Okay, so now our appsetings.json has just allow hosts and everything. After this, I'm going to put a comma and then I'm going to put in quotes Serilog. Okay, and then I'm going to put my curly braces. So this is a JSON file, so it's a JSON format, which means essentially it's pretty similar to C# as far as curly braces have to match. Square brackets indicate an array of objects, whereas curly braces indicate an object, right? So we're going to start off by having an object, which is the curly braces, and then a bunch of properties. All right, so the first property I'm going to say, I'm going to add this here, but not use it quite yet, and that's the using statement. Now, just like in C#, we can have using statements, there's an array of them, inside of our code. I won't put any yet. But this array will allow you to say, instead of saying, system.text. For something, you can put using system.text in this message box and then just use whatever was after that. All right. So just like in C# code, it makes your code a little shorter later on. Okay. So for now, we don't quite add any, but I want to put that there so you know how to put them in later if you need to. Minimum level. This is the minimum level for logging. I'm going to say the default is going to be information, just like before. But I'm going to override. So here's my overrides. My first override is going to be for Microsoft. So anything in the Microsoft namespace is going to be warning. I'm also going to say anything in the system namespace is also warning. All right. So now I've said by default we're going to log information level or higher, but for anything in the Microsoft or the system namespaces, they have to be warning level or higher. All right. Which means I've now essentially turned off all the default logging. So all those messages we saw, we had to kind of scroll through, there's a ton of them. Those are getting turned off because they're not warnings, they're informational. Now those information messages do help us in diagnosing a problem, but we don't want to log them all the time because of the fact that it makes it hard to find our error messages or our log messages. So we're going to turn them off by default to just a warning or higher. Later, if you want to turn them back on for debugging, you could do that right here. Just change this warning to information. All right, so after minimum level, then we're going to have enrich. And what this does is, this is where the structured logging comes in. We're going to enrich our messages to structured logging with additional information. And I'm going to say the first one is from log context. And next, I'm going to say with machine name. Some of these are pretty obvious. With process ID and with thread ID. So essentially, these are going to give you additional pieces of information about what happened when the log message was called. This will allow us to diagnose problems easier because we have, again, the context of what was going on when that happened. So you have the thread ID, you have the process ID, you have the machine name. These you can line up with the information in an event log. Maybe you had an event on your computer. It was unrelated, you thought, to your application, but it has the same process ID. You can match those up and other things as well. So this information can be very helpful. But out of the box, these enrichers do not come with Serilog. We have to add them. So let's go back to our NuGet feed. And we're going to say Serilog.enrichers, enrichers. You got to just like that. We have multiple environment, thread, process, context. So I'm going to grab environment and install that. I'm going to grab thread and install that. And I'm going to grab process. Install that. Notice that these three all come from Serilog.contributors. The next one on the list comes from a person, these from people. So these are additional ones that people have added, but these first three come from the Serilog community as a whole. These are more official, I guess you could say, enrichers. Okay, so we're going to add these three enrichers. And that will give us all four of these options for enrichment. Okay, we'll put a comma at the end of this. And then we're going to say write to. And remember before in our program.cs, I said that normally instead of this read from, you have the dot write to. Instead of doing it here in our code, we're going to do it right here, write to. All right, this is going to be an array. So we're going to have multiple objects in here, so square brackets. Inside here, we're going to say the first one will be really simple. We'll just do console. So, whoops, had my fingers on the wrong keys. Name is going to be console. All right, and that's it. So this will use Serilog and write to the console. Now I believe console is already installed as a sync. So whenever you write to something in Serilog, it's called a sync. So you have the file sync, you have the console sync, and there's a bunch of other syncs as well. This one's a console sync and allows us to print out to the console. I don't think we need to actually add explicitly the console sync because I believe if we look at the Serilog itself, I believe syncs, we have file, and we have console as dependencies with this Serilog.ASP NET Core. So you don't need to add them explicitly because they're already implicitly added. Okay, so that's all we're going to do for our configuration. We've configured it to write to the console. That's it for now. We're going to enrich it, which the console is not a structured sync. So it's just going to have basically the messages, but not all the extra information. So this is not really useful yet, but we'll get there. Now, the one last thing I want to do before we start this up is we do want to turn back on the whenever it calls a page. So whenever a page is called, we want to see that. Right now, since we turned off everything from Microsoft and System, that's not going to happen because they're not warning messages, they're informational messages. But if we go to startup.cs and we say, add a using statement up here, so using Serilog, and then down here after our use static files, so before use routing, we're going to say app.use Serilog request logging. What that's going to do is whenever a request is made, Serilog is going to log that. Okay, so even though it's not, it would normally get ignored, we're going to make sure we log that in Serilog. All right, let's start this again. Again, we're using Kestrel. It's going to look different this time. Notice first of all it's white, and there's a lot less information on the screen. First of all, we have the application starting up. That came from our program.cs right here. All right. And then we have the you requested the index page. So that came from our index page right here. And then next we're going to have all of our log informations until our exception, which we do. And notice the color of the number is different. That's because it's actually a variable that got replaced. Okay? So go through until we get to 56, but 56 instead we get an error, which notice that the ERR is in red instead of INF for information. And it says we caught this exception in the index call, and it has the system.exception. This is our demo exception, where it was line 33. And then at the end, we get this message that says HTTP GET call for just slash, because that's what index is just slash, responded to 200, meaning success, in 416 milliseconds. Notice those are in that purple color because those were also injected values, which means if I go to the privacy page, notice it said how long it took, and it says a slash privacy. So now these values can get searched on later if we were using structured logging, which we're not yet. We're going to get there, okay? But this is now what our logger looks like using Serilog. It's different, but similar, okay? Now, even if you're using a structured logger, I would encourage you to also use console whenever you're doing debugging at least, because console is really easy to look at and say, okay, there's our problem right there. So that one took 416 milliseconds versus 23 milliseconds, which, by the way, that 416 milliseconds, the majority of that time is taken up by throwing the exception, okay? Throwing and catching the exception. So throwing and catching exceptions is expensive. Okay, so let's turn this off, and now let's go back to our appsetings.json. What we're going to do is add another couple of syncs. Remember that this is a square bracket, which means it's an array, which means I can add a comma after our console. And for this one, I'm going to say name is going to be file. And this is a keyword, console and file. These are the sync names. All right? And I'm going to say args. And so the arg is going to be an object. And the first arg is path, all lowercase. And I'm going to say the path is going to be d : double slash demos logs log.txt. Okay, so it's going to log to my d demos logs folder. Now a double slash is because the single slash is an escape character. And so you do it twice and it escapes a slash and it puts just one slash in its place. All right, so that's the path. And then the output template. And this is where you get to choose what do you want your template to look like. And let's start with, these are curly braces here, timestamp. And we'll say it's the G timestamp, which I believe is UTC. And then space, and we'll say message. And we'll say new line, :1, which means it's optional. exception 1, and that's it. So it's going to write out a little bit more information to our log file, but still just one line of text. All right, so there's our second sync. Let's do this. So right now, let's open up that folder. Notice it's empty entirely. So D demo logs, it's empty entirely. Now let's start this up. I'll let it start and get all the way through, and I'm going to shut it down and open up and notice log.txt, and there's our log file. And it looks a lot like the console. All right, there's not much different. In fact, it's pretty much the same thing except for the fact that it can't highlight these. These are just text values, not easy to search on. So if I want to say, give me a range of the values of I that had a problem, it can't do that. Give me the average time it took to load a page, you can't do that in here. Because these are just text values. I have to do some kind of parsing in here to say, okay, where it says in, after saying get, and after it says just and slash, then after in, I'm going to everything until it says ms, pull that out, convert it to a double, and then do it's just a mess. Okay, that's such a messy way of doing things. So what do we do? Well, this is where we get into structured logging. Let's first do structured logging to a file. So I put a comma here, and I'm going to do another section. The name is going to also be file. Okay, and the args is going to be first the path. Let's do the same path here. In fact, let's just copy this whole thing and paste it in. But this time I'm going to say log, instead of .txt, I'm going to say log.json. Okay, but that doesn't do it quite yet. Next, I want to say formatter. Serilog.formatting.json.json formatter, comma, Serilog. Now, by now you've probably started to wonder, well, Tim, where do you get all these settings? If you go to Serilog's documentation, it has documentation for every single sync. It's not entirely complete, but it's pretty close to entirely complete. I mean, they've got a lot of stuff. And so you might have to hunt and peck a little bit. I've tried to pull up the ones that you'd be most likely to use and at least show you how to do them. That way it makes your life a little easier. But the documentation for Serilog is pretty impressive. All right, so we're going to run this again. This time we now have a console, we have a text file, and we have a JSON file. I'm going to run this. I did not delete my old log file. Okay, so it's still there. I'm going to close this back out. Open this up. Let's start with our text file. And there's our first login information. And we start again, and there's the next set of logging information. Okay, now log.json, this is a little harder to look at if you're going to look at through, say, Notepad. But I'm going to open up, I'm going to do a get bash here, it's just easiest, and do code space dot. And this is going to launch VS Code at this folder. Just makes it a little easier. And one of the options in here is I can click on the log.json, and it expands it out, and it makes it a little easier. But then if I right-click on here and say Format Document, it makes it even easier. Now, this is not, in theory, it's not a properly formatted JSON file. And the reason why is because this is an object, and let's expand this out a little bit. This is an object, but notice there's no comma after the object. That's because every line is treated as one entry, not as multiple entries in the same overall object. So these are independent objects. They are not in any way connected with each other. But this is structured logging. So the first one is level is information, timestamp. Notice these are all separate. So the timestamp, the message template says application starting up, and then properties, machine name, process ID, thread ID. Okay? Especially that machine name can be really, really helpful. Go down one more level, and you have even more information. You requested the index page, but notice all the information we're pulling out about that. What the action name was, what the process ID was, parent, which doesn't have a parent right now. Okay? Let's scroll down to where we find our exception. All right, so there's our exception. And let's do this. Let's make it a little bit larger. So our exception here, we have our timestamp, we have that's an error. The message template, we caught this exception in the index get call. And here's the exception. And then the properties for it. So it's a little bit more information even than that. All right. Also notice right above that, message template, this is one of those successful ones. The value of I is loop count value, which seems a little odd. It is not really helpful. But loop count value is 55. So it's not storing 55 in this string. This is the template. This is the value, which is a separate property unto its own. All right? So really valuable being able to pull these pieces apart. Now, let's make it even better. Because a text file, JSON file is not really what we're looking for. All right? It's helpful. It allows us to then bring it into C# if we wanted to and process it, but it's still not immediately usable. So let's use another event sync besides just file or console. We're going to bring another one in that's more helpful. What we're going to bring in is a tool called Seek or SEQ. I'm going to bring up the web page here. This is SEQ or Seek. And what it does is it gives us that structured logging, and it gives it to us in a web page format where we can even see charts and graphs of our application. All right? So some pretty impressive stuff that it can do for our logging right out of the box. Now, I do want to point out that this is not free if you are using more than one person on the team that's using this. Okay? So if you have a team at a job, you're going to have to pay for it. But if you're an individual developer, you don't have to pay for it. There's also, I believe it's free for open source as well. So even though the pricing can be somewhat expensive, this is professional for a full year of support, but it's yours to keep using after that. That's for a year for up to 15 users, but free for development and single user deployment. All right? So you can have this and use this for free. So I don't often show paid products. But this is one of those cases where if as you're learning it and as you are starting to work with it, it's free. It's only when you get onto a team and you want to use it in a team environment that you start to pay money for it. All right? And again, you don't have to use this. I've shown you how to use the console. I've shown you how to use even JSON files so you can have your own parser. But visualizations like this are pretty powerful for showing off what's going on with your application, especially a larger application that's pulling in lots of different events. So we're going to wire this up. And you may say, that sounds intimidating. It's really not. So especially for development purposes, let's do this. Right? We already have the NuGet packages open. And we need to find a new NuGet package, of course. Serilog.syncs.seq. All right, so this is the SEQ sync for Serilog. Install this. And we need to configure our appsetings.json. And we can either leave these in or turn them off. I'm going to leave them in because that way you have them if you download the source code. So comma after this, and we're going to add another object here for another write to. In this case, the name is going to be SEQ. Again, that is the name you have to use. You can't use a different name. That's a keyword. And then the args, server URL. So you have to have a server. Okay, what's our server URL? Well, I'm going to choose HTTP localhost, and the port is going to be, let's do 8081. All right? I don't think I have anything on that port currently. But now I've just demonstrated the idea that we need to have a server somewhere that's running SEQ. So it has to be installed, and there is instructions on how to install it. But I'm not going to install a server, a logging server on my computer that's going to be complicated and take resources, and I have to uninstall it later and all this stuff. Instead, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use Docker. Now, you don't have to use Docker. If you go back to the documentation, there is a documentation in here. I believe you go to documentation, it's going to have how to install it. Yep, how to install it with Windows. And so here are the steps for installing it. You do a next kind of thing and set it up. We're not going to do that. We're going to use instead Docker, because Docker allows me to spool up an instance of this in Linux, of all things, on Windows, but in Linux, that will do the logging for me, and then it's not going to touch anything on my machine. But it's treating it as if it's a real live application, which it is. Okay, so we're going to learn how to configure Docker. And it may sound like that's intimidating. This is actually really easy. If you have Docker installed, okay, now if you don't have Docker installed, I believe it is hub.docker.com. And then you sign in, and there's going to be an icon down here to say Install Docker Desktop. Do that, and then what you're going to get once you install it is a bunch of settings that look like this. Okay, so this is already installed. Make sure it's running when you log in, and check for updates. Under Shared Drive, make sure that you share your drive so you can have access data from your hard drive into a container. That'll be important because you want to save the logging data outside of our Docker container. And the reason why is because I'm going to turn my Docker container off and delete it when I'm not using it. And yet when I want to bring it back up, I want to have all my log files that already happened. So I'll show you that in just a minute. All right, those are the big ones. I do have it set so that's operating. There's some configuration here. But I've got it set here for running Linux. Even though I'm on Windows, I'm running Linux containers. Okay, so that's the other configuration bit. All right, now if Docker is of somewhat concern to you, you're not sure what Docker is, I do have an intro to Docker video that will walk you through all these things and get you up and running in no time. The reason why Docker is so important is because it makes tasks like this, like spooling up a web server with a logging system on it, trivial. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up PowerShell. So PowerShell, and it doesn't matter where I am. So if I were to do Docker images, you see I have a couple of images here, but not many. All right, so I'm going to say Docker run. Now Docker run is going to run an image. So you already have an image built, and you're just going to run it. Now we haven't built an image because Seek did it for us. They built an image for us that is their server. So all they have to do is say run. -D for detached mode. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Let's change this to be 28 and see that. Okay, a little better. So -D for detached mode. And then I'm going to say / restart space unless stopped. So detached mode means I don't have to keep this window open in order to keep my container running. The -- restart unless stopped indicates that my container will, if there's a problem, let's say I reboot, or if something crashes, it's going to restart that container. So it's always going to try and restart that logging Seek container, unless I were to say explicitly stop this container. Okay. Next, I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to say Seek is the name, SEQ. -e for an environmental variable, I'm going to say all caps except underscore EULA equals Y. That's going to accept the end user license agreement and say, yes, we agree to the terms of the Seek server. -v. What this is going to do is set up a volume that's going to allow our system to talk to our local machine. The importance here is I want to save my logging files on my hard drive, not on the container hard drive, because the container might go away. In fact, it will go away at some point. I want to keep my logs. That way, if I spool up a new container later, I can point to the same location and have my logs still. So we're going to point to location. The location is going to be d:/demos/logs. If you remember, that's this location right here. We already have 2 log files. That's for our application log files, but we'll put also our log files for the Seek server. Okay, same location. So logs, and then I say :/data. So what that will do is the /data folder inside the Seek container is going to actually be my d-demo logs folder on my hard drive. All right, so we're going to map that container over, or map that folder over. So whenever it stores data in the data folder in the container, it's actually stored on my hard drive instead. All right, then I have the port. So -p, I'm going to say that the port I want is 8081. That's the port I'm going to use on my computer. That's going to map to the port 80 on the Seek container. Okay? And finally, with no other parameters here, I'm going to say datalust, so DATALUST /seek : and that is that's the image I want to pull. So datalust /seek. So I'm going to resize just a little bit. There you go. So datalust /seek : So we're going to pull the latest image of that Seek server. Okay? So it's going to run detach mode. It's going to restart unless stopped. It's going to name this container Seek. It's going to accept the end user license agreement. It's going to map the data folder internally to be the d-demos log file on my computer. And it's going to map the internal port 80 to be my computer's port 8081. Okay? I hit run, and it says, hey, I can't find that image locally. I'm going to pull it down from the cloud. So it's currently pulling that image down. The image is a little large, not massive, but it's large enough that it's going to take a little bit to download. It's downloaded, and now it's running. Okay, which also means if I move over here, notice the d-demo logs folder now has seek.json, and it has the logs folder, extents folder, and documents folder. This image is now running. I can close this out. If I were to open up Visual Studio Code and go to my Docker, it has one container up. Okay, you can see the container here. You can see the image that it downloaded. So we're up and running. If I go to my browser and I were to go localhost :8081, there is my Seek server up and running. You see how easy that was? It was just, I needed to run that one Docker command, and it's up and running. Now, there's nothing in here yet because we haven't logged anything yet. Let's change that. We're pointing to it already. We've installed the package. Let's run this. Okay, so it's going to launch. There's our console. Give it a second. You might get this error once in a while to prevent unsafe abort when evaluating the function system.runtime.loader.assembly load context, yada yada. All threads were allowed to run. This is an error you'll only get in development when you're trying to monitor things, and that's okay. You can hit OK and it will go. And now our web server is started. We can hit stop. we can come over here to the Seek server and hit refresh. Check us out. We got a bunch of stuff in our server, including that error. Click on it. There's all the information about the error. If you click on this, the value of I is 55. Notice, let's zoom in here a little bit. The value of I is 55. That's the actual message we would see in the console. And yet, if you hover over it, it says loop count value. Come down here, we can see loop count value is 55. So this is going to show you more information about the requests. The really cool thing is, and let's zoom out a little bit, is if you go over here to dashboards in the upper right hand corner, click on dashboards and go overview, we can now see all the errors in the last 5 minutes. Every 5 seconds, we can refresh this every 10 seconds, let's say. So it shows the errors and versus the information. So 59 informational messages, which is 98.3%, and we only have one error. If I were to come over, let's start this again, and we'll bring this back up while it's starting. And it's going to pop up an error here in just a minute. The refresh will hit, and it's going to show us you have a second error. There we go. So second error popped up. So this is now a live look at your dashboard. You can add more things here if you want, like the different type of calls. You can query on things. There's a lot of information you can pull off of these dashboards. You can add even more to them. So this is the power of structured events. So a structured event gives you a whole bunch of information about the event that you can query on. You can pull the values of those things you inserted out. So loop count value of 55. You can get more information about an exception. So this, first of all, it turned red, so you can see it. And then there's information you can pull out of here, including the full stack trace of that exception. We can also say only give us certain things, like only give us our errors. Well, there's our errors. We have filtered out all the ones that aren't errors, and now it's just these two. You can then do some work on those and see what the errors are and figure out, why they happened. All right. So there's a lot of information you can pull out of this, and it's a great way to just have something up and running very quickly that will monitor your application and give you information about what's going on. The problem sometimes with the text files, whether it's a JSON file or just a .txt or the console, is it's very easy to miss stuff, and you don't necessarily pop in there and look at it and sort through everything because it's kind of hard to look at. With this, it gives you a really clear indication, oh, there's my errors, or you filter on them, or you go to your dashboard and see them pop up and then do some investigation based upon that. So I click that there, and it says there's the exception for that time point. So, and again, there's a query that it ran to find those. So there's some really very, very valuable pieces of information you can pull out of this, and it gives you good visibility into your errors and logging. And that's the most important thing, because if you're just logging stuff and you're not doing anything with it, why are you logging? Logging has to have a purpose. And one of the purposes is to make your application better by exposing any errors that you might not have otherwise known were happening. And the way to easily expose that is to have some type of logging system that includes a dashboard like this where you can keep an eye on things and go, oh, we had an issue, and this is, by the way, this 5 minutes, you can actually say the last 24 hours. So if you want to have a broad overview, but this will allow you to dive in and say, okay, we've got an issue in our application. We saw a spike in errors. Let's drill in, find the issue, and then look at those exceptions and pull the information out and figure out what's going on. That's what logging is for, to help with those type of things, or to give you a flow so that if you're trying to figure out how do users use our application, you can come over to events and you could filter based upon the person or the machine. So let's say that I am usually one user uses one machine. You can say, let's filter only on this machine here, and then say, okay, what did this person do from the time they logged in to the time they logged out? And you can track their movements using log statements and understand that, oh, they're skipping around here. We could put a link that would make their job easier or something of that nature. So logging can be very powerful as long as you use it. If you don't use it, why bother? And that's why it's also nice to be able to have the values in the appsetings.json, because you can come up here and say, you know what, we're going to change this to warning and not log anything else, because we're not using anything else. We're just using warning and hire. And so why clog the server up with a whole bunch of files we don't need? So you can do that, all right? But then when you have an issue where you say, okay, I need more context around that warning, you can change it back to information and then run it on that machine, or run it everywhere, but then capture just that machine and say, okay, what's the context around this error? What were they doing that led up to this issue? So logging is very important and can be very, very powerful if you use it right. Serilog makes it even more powerful than the default logging to a text file or logging to even a database, because this structured logging allows you to get some more context and do some filtering based upon those different variables. So structured logging is a really powerful addition to .NET Core, and Serilog takes advantage of it really well. With structured logging for Serilog, the easiest thing to do is probably the JSON file. So that's this right here. That's pretty easy to do, but it's a little harder to read. And if you have the ability to either run a Docker container or install the web server for Seek, then this is a great option for getting visibility into your application and be able to use those structured events to their greatest extent. Okay, so that's a video on Serilog and then how to use Seek with Serilog. I hope you've found some value in it. I hope that you can see how to make your applications even better and be able to really dive into what's going on behind the scenes of your application. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them, so write them down in the comments below, or other thoughts as well on how you can make Serilog even better, or maybe another option besides Serilog, like nlog or something else. Okay? Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.